So we're going to talk about ALM and the Power Platform. It kind of, with when it comes to Power BI, Power Apps, Power, Automate, when it comes to Dataverse, when it comes to like all things associated with a solution, ALM is a huge topic right now, and it's something that Microsoft is investing in, because they're getting so much pushback from customers about like, what is this ALM story, right? Like, how do we take a solution that we've built? It's got a Power BI report, it's got some flows, it's got some Dataverse tables, it's got webhooks, it's got all this stuff in it. Like, how do we get this into another environment, share it with other people, and wire up all of those things like in that downstream environment? It's not a simple task in any way. So I'm Michael Ochs. I am the Executive Vice President with Excellence. I'm an MVP, a Microsoft MVP as well. And my contact info is here. Most of you probably know me, but just from the user group. But I've been working with the PowerCat team at Microsoft now for close to 2 years as a vendor. So I'm not a Microsoft employee. I am a vendor working with Aiden and our team at Excellence on this initiative that Marc Schweigert is also on this call, and he is, as I mentioned earlier, my supervisor, but also, what is your official title, Marc? I don't know what your official title is, but
I'm the group program manager for PowerCat tools.
Yeah, so
I don't really care much about titles, so.
But lots of knowledge on this call, and probably areas where I will need Marc to fill in for me. But this conversation is about, there's been a lot of announcements around ALM. Before we did a session on ALM Accelerator, it's something that the PowerCat team built in order to fill a gap in the platform. And since then, there's been a lot of announcements and in-product experiences that I've released that fill those gaps. And I wanted to talk about like kind of ALM all up in the Power Platform. Like where...
Mike, I'm going to call an audible. Mike's not giving himself enough credit. So Mike and I have worked very deeply with the core platform team over the last 2 years to help them understand how to improve ALM in the platform and take a lot of the lessons learned that Mike has led in PowerCat, helping us with the ALM Accelerator and drive the ALM that we do for our own team to then be the voice of customers and improve ALM in the platform. So I just wanted to call that out, Mike, because you're not giving yourself enough credit.
I appreciate that, but yeah, it's been a fun adventure to be on. I honestly didn't think that ALM would be like my thing. I don't want it to be my thing for the rest of my career. I'm actually looking forward to the platform doing a lot of this stuff. So that's what we're going to talk about today. So we're going to talk about pipelines for Power Platform. That was released GA last week on March 1st. We're going to talk about build tools automation, which is the build tasks that are available in Azure DevOps. It's PAC CLI, which is a command line interface that's developer friendly, that can be used to automate deployments, automate ALM. And then we're going to talk about the ALM Accelerator, which is the thing that I kind of own right now on the PowerCat team. And we release on a monthly basis. We're an open source project, which I think this is one of the first open source projects of a low code solution for Microsoft ever, which is really cool. And then we're going to just talk about best fit and best practices, right? Like, which one of these things do I use? When should I use it? That story is going to change from today to tomorrow to 2 years from now, but we're going to talk about the state of ALM right now in the Power Platform. All right. So to begin with, pipelines for Power Platform was announced as GA last week, and it's, as Marc mentioned, we've worked with, PowerCat team works with customers and fairly large customers of Microsoft on making sure that they're able to adopt the platform and govern the platform in a way that is in line with their their internal needs. So ALM is a big is a big topic there, right? Like governance spans all kinds of things, right? Like you can't have connections out to certain resources and things like that, and and you need to make sure that you know what's going on internally when people are building apps, and so governance is a broad topic, and the ALM Accelerator kind of sits under the COE starter kit, and the COE starter kit is the center of excellence starter kit, and a lot of the features of the COE starter kit have to do with governance, and ALM is part of governance. Let's make sure when I'm deploying my solution that all the best practices are being applied. Let's make sure that we're not shipping passwords and things like that in our downstream environments, or committing those sort of secrets into source control. It's a very big topic, and it's a big topic for enterprise customers, but it's something that even smaller customers need to think about, and especially government customers, right? Like sovereign cloud customers, GCC customers need to be thinking about, and that's this audience especially understands that. So pipelines for Power Platform is, and there is kind of a story behind this, but pipelines for Power Platform was built and it was intended to be for the makers in the platform, right? Like most of us, a lot of us, Aiden, myself, Marc, even Kylie, a lot of us come from the sort of Dynamics days where we weren't building these low code sort of solutions. We were building code, right? We were building code first. We were building plugins and things like that. And a lot of the big consulting companies out there have built ALM processes on top of that. But when it came to the idea that now this is going to be somebody in HR or somebody in accounting who's building these apps, like how do we enable them to do ALM when the IT doesn't have the capacity to support that, and we need to provide the ability for them to do the same thing, but in a way that's different from the pro code, or the code first, right? Like we understand what ALM is and what coming from the development side, but makers and don't necessarily understand what that means, right? So the first iteration of pipelines for Power Platform is maker focused. It's like we all know how to export a solution. We all know how to import that solution in a downstream environment. And then we get a prompt and it says, wire up this connection, tell me what the environment variables are. Okay, go deploy this thing into a downstream environment. What Pipelines for Power Platform does is effectively kind of remove that manual process, right? So now you can actually deploy a solution from your maker environment without having to export, import, and run through those steps. Those steps are still there. It's still going to ask you what your connections are. It's still going to ask you what your environment variables are. It's going to do some validation for you. So it's going to run solution checker for you and things like that. But now the maker in the maker experience has the ability to deploy a solution. So I'll just run through this. This is a recorded demo, but this is effectively the experience for the admin to set up a pipeline. So you link development environments to your pipeline. You link deployment environments to your pipeline. And when you share that with, so when you associate that with a development environment, then it shows up in your maker's experience. This is a model-driven app. This is built on top of Power Platform. It was built on top of Dataverse. It should look very familiar to everybody, but this is effectively, just a model-driven app that sits, that can be installed using the admin center, using PPAC, and you can go and configure your deployment pipelines using a model-driven app if you're an admin administrator. This is the maker experience. So once that's set up, you're selecting the pipeline, you're selecting the downstream environment, you're getting prompted to, you're going to get prompted to set up your connections, you're going to get prompted to set up your environment variables. There's things that aren't in this today that will be in the future. Some of those things are things that we have in the ALM Accelerator, and I'll talk to that a little bit later about the direction that we're heading and how we're going to integrate with this experience and enable some of those scenarios that aren't enabled today. But you can select environment variables, data source environment variables, you can deploy it, and everything should be working in the downstream environment. And that's the ideal scenario, right? Like, you don't have to go into the downstream environment. You don't have to go into the production environment or the test environment and wire up connection references or environment variables. You can do that during deployment, and it's all working in the downstream environment. So this part of the demo is about how PAC CLI is lighting up some of this. So PAC CLI is the tool, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a little bit. But PAC CLI is the developer tool for pretty much everything associated with ALM, and associated with the direction that Microsoft is headed with enabling developer first or code first or professional developer functionality. So you actually can run a pipeline. If you didn't want to run a pipeline manually, like we just looked at from the maker interface, you can actually run that pipeline using PAC CLI now. So this is all part of the GA. It's all it's all available today. And let me skip to the next one here. All right, so I won't go too deep into this slide. This is essentially, I mentioned that there's a model-driven app in Dataverse. It's a first-party app that Microsoft has produced. It's got tables behind it. It's got forms. It's got views. It's got relationships between tables and things like that. I won't get too deep into this, but effectively everything that we saw during the setup of the pipelines for Power Platform is saved as records, or what do we call them today? Rows in Dataverse, and they're associated with tables, which is really cool, right? The product team is actually building, and they've been doing this for a while, but the product team is building functionality on the same platform that we build functionality on, which is, I think, very cool. Like it's a sort of inception paradigm where everything they built, technically we could have built as a team out in the wild. So it's a model app. It's got tables behind it. It's security role based permissioning. All of the information about the deployments are saved as rows in Dataverse. Anything that gets created, for example, a pipeline or a deployment request, get saved into Dataverse, so you can run flows against those things. You can, essentially, extend it beyond what it is using the same technology that we use today, for our custom solutions. So the direction that this is headed, and that's a good segue into the extensibility story. There are going to be some limitations. The extensibility story is that they're going to light up specific areas where you can plug in to pipelines. There will be some areas where you can't, because just due to the infrastructure behind it. But the idea is that right now a pipeline is, you can effectively think of it as you clicking the export button, downloading the solution, clicking the import button, uploading the solution, and it asks you all the same questions that we just saw in that demo, right? Like, what are your connections? What are your environment variables? But there's going to be extensibility hooks in pipelines that will allow you to plug in at certain times, right? So when you export a solution, or when you request a deployment, there will be a record that's created that is a deployment request, and that deployment request will have the solution associated with it. So it'll be a file field, just like we've all used in the past. It'll be a attachment to the record, and you'll be able to trigger certain things based on when that thing gets created. And that would be your pre-stage condition. All right. So I need to do something before this thing's deployed. It could be an approval. In some cases, it may be, I want to unpack this thing. I want to put it into source control. I want to expand it. I want to, whatever it may be. There'll be a pre-stage in that pipeline for you to do that. Additionally, there will post-stage conditions. So I've deployed the solution generally, or maybe normally I would just go into the downstream environment. I would tap in some data that wasn't part of the solution, or I would, whatever it may be, like I would have to do that manually. There's going to be post-stage conditions in the pipeline extensibility to allow you to automate those things and make sure that your solution is in a working state. So this is, I think I need to click on this, but this is sort of a preview of what's coming as far as that's concerned. So you can see our production environment here. There's a checkbox to say there's a pre-deployment step required. Effectively, what will happen is there will be a trigger. That trigger will execute. That trigger will ultimately write back to that record, and it will tell the deployment whether to go forward or whether to stop. And in this case, it's an approval. So this is a flow approval. Is this good to deploy or is it not? And the ultimate state of this is it will decide whether or not to write back to that record to continue with the deployment. Pretty straightforward. Obviously, a requirement in general from an ALM standpoint. If you're a pro code or code first person, then you probably do this with pull requests in GitHub or Azure DevOps, and it's pretty familiar. I'm going to pause there, and I'm going to ask if there's any questions, because I've gone through a lot and I still think I have a lot to go through. So has there been any questions, or Mark, would you like to interject at all?
No, I think you nailed it so far.
Cool. All right. Let me skip past this. So some of this is, so the extensions are to come. They were not GA, but they will be coming out shortly. The ability to do deployments using SPN. This is, if you're not familiar with SPNs, there's a difference between like sort of imagine you have a administrative user or administrator user in your system that's responsible for doing deployments. You can automate deployments using an administrator user, or you can use what's called an SPN or a service principal to do deployments. And those service principals aren't named users. So it's not Mike Ochs at excellence.com. It's some user that was created in Azure DevOps and associated, in Azure and associated with a application user in Dataverse. And the benefit of doing that, there's quite a few benefits actually, because one, multi-factor authentication doesn't apply to service principals. So they're non-interactive users, right? Like you have your user and you've got, they send a text to your phone, or you have an authentication app and you have to go do that multi-factor authentication in order to actually log into Power Apps. SPNs don't have that requirement, so they're able to kind of act headlessly, as they say, right? Like they're not interactive user accounts. They're not people with phones. They're just automation accounts. And the ability to do that, and it's a huge requirement from most enterprise organizations, as well as sovereign cloud organizations, to be able to interact using an SPN as opposed to using an interactive user. So that capability is coming, and it's not available now. When you deploy a solution using Pipelines for Power Platform, you're deploying as yourself, right? Like, and your authentication to the system is what's effectively pushing things into a downstream environment. It's what's creating the connections, and you need to have some of those, permissions to be able to do that. It's not ideal because, right, like you leave the company and you're the one that deployed the solution. Now you own all the assets. Now now you're the owner of that pipeline. It's not a good situation. You really want to be in a state where you use SPN. The ALM Accelerator uses SPN by default, and this is something that's coming, and it's an important thing to enable using Pipelines for Power Platform. So North Star for Pipelines for Power Platform, it's the strategic direction that Microsoft is headed, right? And it's exciting that this is lighting up in the platform, right? Like, this has been something that people have been asking for forever. It's something that, as a CAT team, when I came on board 2 years ago, it was Marc who had built the first ALM Accelerator, but Marc had been doing ALM years prior to that. I had done ALM in Dataverse years prior to that, and we were all using different tools, and we were all using our own sort of flavor of ALM to do it. And now that it's in product, like, this is exciting. This is the first time that an environment or a maker could reach out to another environment and make changes in that environment or deploy solutions. And it's kind of crazy that it took as long as it has to do that, but it's exciting that this is now in the product. So but this will be the future of ALM in the product, and it's going to evolve. So everything I just stated, you can throw it out the window 2 months from now, because the chances are it's going to be different. It's going to be better. It's going to be I'm going to have to come back and do an update about it. But this is the direction that Microsoft is headed in their ALM story, and it's a huge deal. It's a huge deal for companies who want to enable governance around ALM. So, all right, so switching gears, and this may be a little bit jolting. I'm going to talk a little bit about, I mentioned the CLI previously. Now we're kind of stepping back from that whole, the whole maker experience, right? Like, I'm building apps, I'm building Power Automates, and I've got some tables associated with those, and I can use pipelines for Power Platform, and that's good enough. It's not always good enough for everybody. And for a lot of companies, they do fusion development. And what fusion development is yes, we've got, kind of these makers who are just building apps and flows and changing tables, but we've also got a whole team that does Azure integration, that builds plugins, that builds PCF, right? So none of that is currently supported in pipelines for Power Platform. My guess is that none of that Azure ALM will ever be supported in pipelines for Power Platform. So there needs to be a way for these sort of more advanced scenarios to be enabled, and the CLI and some of the stuff that we're doing in the ALM Accelerator is what's going to enable that. So the Power Apps CLI, it is a command line interface. It's geared towards professional developers to be able to do things in their sort of native interfaces, right? Like if I want to go into Visual Studio Code and I want to quickly export a solution using PowerShell, I can do that with the CLI, or I want to unpack a solution or whatever it may be. So the CLI was built with that premise. This is the professional, or not, I wouldn't say professional, but the code first developers' way of interacting with Power Platform. And the CLI has evolved over the past year, maybe 2 years, probably 2 years now since, but has evolved from what it previously was, which was, kind of a cool tool for developers, but now to a platform independent way of interacting with Power Platform. Meaning you can run the CLI on Linux, you can run the CLI on Windows, you can run it on a Mac, I think, for the most part. There's some commands that you can't run because some of them are based on Windows loosely. I think the deployment configuration data functionality is only available on Windows. But anyway, so it was completely replatformed so that it was platform independent. And it is also the backing of all of the Azure DevOps tasks in Azure DevOps. And it's also the backing for all of the GitHub actions in GitHub. And who knows, in the future, it may be the backing for Circle CI, or, it may be the backing for Atlantis, is that what it's called? Or anyway, but it may be the backing for pretty much every tool.
So Mike,
Atlassian, that's what it is.
I'll take that one further, because
yep.
We actually have a Power Platform release wave note item that alludes to the fact that we will support more CI/CD platforms other than GitHub and Azure DevOps. And as Mike was alluding to, it will absolutely be based on PAC CLI, right? And I don't know what, one of the challenges Mike and I have is we know a lot that we can't say, right? And so I don't know exactly what I can say about this, other than the idea is to simplify how those other platforms acquire the PAC CLI functionality. Just like if you just reference a GitHub action or GitHub task, you get it all sort of automatically brought into the CI/CD platform. So generally speaking, that is the direction, and that's what that roadmap item on the release notes are for the next release wave, is making it easier for those who don't use GitHub and Azure DevOps but do CI/CD to have the same functionality themselves through PAC CLI.
Yep. Yeah. Thanks for that, Mark. So maybe I went a little started geeking out a little bit on that, but effectively, the Power App CLI, the what they is referred to commonly as PAC CLI, but now it's Power Platform CLI, I believe, is the name they're using for the most part. But all of that sort of goodness, all that functionality that is in the Azure DevOps tasks, that's in GitHub Actions, is surfaced or backed by Power Platform CLI, which leads me here. The build tools, right? So the build tools, just a layer on top of PAC CLI that allows you to do things like import solutions, export solutions, unpack solutions, a number of different tasks that you would do in a normal sort of ALM process. And move through that one. There are capabilities lighting up based on pipelines for Power Platform as well. They continue to add tasks or capabilities to PAC CLI or Power Platform CLI as new things come available. So the ability to import a solution into an environment and also associate it with a configuration file, for example, that has all of your connections in it, has all your environment variables in it. There's a number of other things that aren't supported today, but more than likely will be in the future. And so that's kind of the direction that this is all headed. All right. So that's a segue into the ALM Accelerator for Power Platform. It's a long way of getting to what I think the title of this session was. But I had planned to come in today and talk about, or this evening, and talk about the ALM Accelerator for Power Platform. But because Pipelines for Power Platform was released last week, and because we've been working internally with the product team at Microsoft on how we're going to align to this new functionality that they're releasing, which is awesome, as I mentioned. What are we going to do with the ALM Accelerator? What is it going to just go away? We've got customers who are using it, large customers who are using the ALM Accelerator today, and are we going to just abandon it, or are we going to move towards augmenting Pipelines for Power Platform with the ALM Accelerator for Power Platform? And for anybody who's not familiar with what the ALM Accelerator was, and you weren't on the last couple of calls where we talked about it, it was that sort of gap filling app that was built originally by Marc, who kind of was the brainchild for it. I took that over, and we've since iterated on it repeatedly. It is a open source project. It's on GitHub, as I mentioned. You can go today and you can look at the source code for it, and you can look at the pipelines behind it, and all of the documentation that we've written for learn.microsoft.com. And it's a completely out in the open project that we built. And we built originally, the idea was that we build it internally for PowerCat. So PowerCat releases kits. PowerCat releases more than just the ALM Accelerator. PowerCat releases the COE Starter Kit, the Automation Kit, as well as the Creator Kit. And chances are by the next time we talk, there'll be another kit, but it's the same sort of premise, right? Like, there's a gap in functionality in the platform that we recognize and that our customers recognize. And we can't just say, hey, customer, you're going to have to wait 2 semesters for this to come out. Let's go ahead and build it with low code, and let's provide some functionality, kind of like the XRM toolbox, right? Like, just let's provide that functionality to makers and to developers now, and then eventually kind of guide, show how customers are using it, and then report back to the product team and say, hey, look, this is something that should be in the product. So ALM Accelerator was built with the idea that it would be used internally by the PowerCat team to do ALM for the COE starter kit. And we do that today. So COE starter kit releases every month. Automation kit releases mostly monthly. Creator kit releases mostly monthly. And all of that is driven by the ALM Accelerator. So this isn't something that we built and we just put out there. This is something that we use, and the ALM Accelerator is part of the COE starter kit, and we use the ALM Accelerator to do ALM for the ALM Accelerator. So it's kind of a cool story to, we're eating our own dog food, and we're also, blazing new trails in a way on doing open source development in the Power Platform. And I think somebody just might have came off mute, but is there a question? Okay. So it is an open source project. We are, as I mentioned, aligned and communicating with the product team constantly, and making sure that every time a new functionality is released in PAC CLI, for example, or in pipelines for Power Platform, that we are aligning to what they're doing, right? So in a lot of cases, we've written a whole bunch of custom PowerShell code, which is a little bit gnarly, and then PAC CLI comes out with a task, or the build tools come out with a task that does exactly what we're doing in PowerShell. We align to that, and it's a reference sample of how to do ALM on top of the tools that we were discussing earlier. There are extensibility hooks in the ALM Accelerator. So, if you want to, we were talking about earlier, if you want to deploy a solution in Power Platform, but you also want to provision some Azure resources, you can do that. You'll need a developer or somebody who can write YAML in Azure DevOps to do that. But there are those extensibility hooks in order to do that. We also, our issue backlog is completely, and our release plan is completely out in the open on GitHub. And as I said, we've done quite a bit of documentation. We're actually working on overhauling our documentation right now to be a little bit more consumable. But yeah, so there's a lot of resources out there for the ALM Accelerator. All right. These are just some of the features. I don't know if I want to get into this, but the idea here is that from the beginning, we wanted to take the stance that this would be the ALM Accelerator would be friendly to both code first developers as well as makers, right? Like low code developers. And so we kind of took the stance that, you know what, if you are a code first developer and you're comfortable with the idea of like a commit to Git and creating pull requests, and that's how you do your code first development, then we'll give you that ability inside of the ALM Accelerator. But at the same time, we wanted to make it friendly to just makers, right? Like, what am I actually trying to do here? I don't want to think about creating a new branch from main and creating a pull request into main and things like that. Really, what I want to do is save my solution and deploy my solution. So we have added sort of those two sort of personas, and there's a gray area in between, right? Like, it may be you want to do some of that stuff, or you want to allow some of your users to do some of that stuff and some of them not to. So we've made it very configurable to allow for both of those scenarios. Originally, the ALM Accelerator was really hard to set up. And that was one of the biggest blockers that we had just a if you printed it out, it was probably 70 pages of documentation on how to set it up. And I never did print it out, but it was just a huge doc on how to set the thing up. And it was a big blocker to people adopting it because it was not easy to configure for the first time. Since then and recently, and one of the things I was thinking about discussing in this talk was actually like how easy it is now to get things set up. And our documentation, still working on some of the updates, but our documentation now does point to, the sort of simpler setup. There is a setup wizard now. It's all built on Fluent UI, PCF. It looks very much like you're working in the Maker portal when you're setting it up. And this number of steps has gone from 100 plus to maybe 10 or 15. So just a heads up there, if you tried it before, the experience for the setup is a lot better than it used to be in the past. The last thing I want to just kind of talk about on this screen or on this slide is I talked about how Pipelines for Power Platform handles connection references, it handles environment variables. It'll likely start handling things like app sharing of flows, things like that going forward. But there are some nuanced things in Dataverse that may take a while to light up in Pipelines for Power Platform. So one of them came to us through GitHub. Somebody submitted an issue and they said, you know what, I've got webhooks in my solution. And I want those webhooks to be configured to point to the correct environment in my test environment and another environment in my production environment. Like webhooks, not a hugely used piece of functionality, but there are a lot of those types of configurations in Dataverse that I'm sure you're all aware of because you are professionals who have worked with the platform for a long time. But there are a lot of those types of things that it's going to be a while before they actually come into Pipelines for Power Platform. So that being said, and I'll skip over this slide, our plan going forward is to be a complement to Pipelines for Power Platform. We build a UI on top of Azure DevOps pipelines that do all of that export, unpack, commit to Git, deploy, set up all the deployment settings in the downstream environment, run automated tests, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We've got 40 plus YAML file or 40 plus PowerShell files and 60 YAML files, right? That all kind of drive this pipeline that we built. The app itself is just a layer on top of those pipelines. And what we decided is we kind of want to get out of the business of creating UIs for that, because the UI and the UX in Pipelines for Power Platform is so much better. And if we go back a slide or two, you'll see it doesn't look bad. It looks okay. But to be honest with you, the end product experience is much better. And they've taken away they've built a lot of the stuff that we built previously, right? Like you can see this configuration or configure deployment settings, right? Connection references, environment variables. That's all done in product now. And the idea is that we want to get out of the business of building UIs and we want to get into the business of extending what's been built in product, removing things when they're added to the end product, and moving forward, enabling more people. And I see Mark came off.
I was just going to give you guff because I built the original UI. So
yeah, It still looks good, honestly. It's
And I
not
have
bad.
no UI skills, so I actually agree with your commentary. But if I may digress for a moment, like if you folks have paid attention to some of our other kits, including the Creator Kit, which enables us to build better user experiences, right? And the enhancements to the COE kit of late, we actually build user experiences inside of CAT tools now that rival the quality of make.powerapps.com and make.powerapp.com. And if it weren't for Pipelines for Power Platform, we probably would rewrite the UI to be more like Pipelines for Power Platform. But the good news is we don't have to anymore because it's an in-product experience, right? Which is what most people want, right? They don't want to have to install a separate kit to light up this functionality or have to roll it themselves. They want it just to be there in the product, right? And so it's kind of exciting for Mike and I anyway that the day is finally coming that not only is the user experience that we've built going to be able to go away in lieu of in-product experiences, but if you look at what's in our pipelines today, there's a lot of things we do in our pipelines that Pipelines for Power Platform does. And so our pipelines will become more simplified over time, right? Which will make them faster, right? And more work will be done natively in the platform and less work will have to be done through extensibility, and hooks into Azure DevOps and GitHub and other CI/CD platforms. But as Mike's alluded to, there'll always be a need for Pipelines for Power Platform and technologies like GitHub, Azure DevOps, or some other CI/CD technology to work together. Right.
Yep. So we've been working with the Pipelines for Power Platform team very closely for the past 2 years, and as they were creating the functionality, as they were building the functionality, they worked with us on where we needed extensibility and what we needed and what our customers were asking for, right? Like that's the most important thing. Customers want source control, and Pipelines for Power Platform doesn't have it today, but they want to be able to commit things into GitHub or Azure DevOps Git, and they want to be able to do these sort of code first sort of processes that they do internally for their Azure projects and things like that. So that's a big area for us to be able to hook in. When I was talking about those pre-deployment steps, being able to hook in, take that solution, download it, push it into a branch in Git, and create a pull request, as opposed to just that kind of generic approval flow that was there. So now you can actually see side by side what has changed, line by line, what has changed in the Git pull requests. There's a lot of details here on other areas where we're extended. The code first is a big one as well. So the idea behind the ALM Accelerator has always been you build off of source control. You don't export a solution zip file and deploy that. You take what's in source control, you build that solution zip file, and then you deploy that, because professional developers want to go in, edit their plugin code, edit their PCF, and then their build process to go pull those edits and deploy those, as opposed to now I got to push that up into my development environment. Now I got to export it. And so that's another area where we're heavily invested as far as the ALM Accelerator extensions. Running a little low on time, but this has been a good talk. So this is what we talked about essentially, right? Like there's all these options. You may be a shop that is 2 people and you're exporting solutions, importing them in a downstream environment, and you're good with that. Perfectly fine. Nothing wrong with that. But as you kind of move your way up to more, either more people involved in the development process or more people involved in the usage of a solution, or more governance around your environments and things like that, then you need to start to think about, okay, I need an ALM process for this. Like it's not, and we've done this internally. Like honestly, when I came onto this project and started building out a lot of the ALM infrastructure for the COE starter kit, it was Manuela, who's in charge of the COE starter kit, who was like, oh my God, we've been doing all of this manually forever. And it's taken us days to be able to put out a release. And now it's like hours, right? Like there's a point where I think you just generally realize that you need an ALM process. Like this is too much work. This is too much manual work. It's too error prone. And at some point you're going to need to put an ALM process in place. So you've got pipelines for Power Platform. You've got the automated deployment tools. I didn't really describe what the use case is for that, but we'll look at that on the next slide. And then you've got the ALM Accelerator. So here's sort of the breakdown. The pipelines at this point in time, these are subject to change. They will change in the future. There's no service principal support with pipelines. There's really not any IT requirement, as the first bullet item says, to set this up. There's no source code integration. It does require elevated permissions, so the person deploying the solution has to have permissions in the downstream environment in order to deploy it, and then on from there, effectively. But I think the point of this slide really is, if your scenario is right now I'm exporting solutions manually, having somebody go into a downstream environment and deploy them manually, and that can be an error-prone process, use pipelines for Power Platform. And there's additional capabilities in pipeline for Power Platform, which are, it runs solution checker. It will check for dependencies in your downstream environment. ALM Accelerator does run solution checker as well. We don't check for dependencies, so that's a gap there. But then all the way on the right side of the slide is just the roll your own scenario. So if you are a very custom, very specific shop, or you've already headed down the path of rolling your own ALM, you may want to think about going back to like ALM Accelerator. ALM Accelerator is going to be the path forward for anybody who has rolled their own pipelines. Path forward meaning path forward to be able to leverage pipelines for Power Platform plus extensibility. So like I said, we've been working closely with the product team, and we're aligned on the fact that a lot of the capabilities in ALM Accelerator are going to be utilized for pipelines, or with pipelines for Power Platform as extensions. And if you want to be on an upgrade path to all of that stuff coming into the product, then your best bet is to start with ALM Accelerator if you haven't started with ALM, or pipelines, depending. So anyway, that's sort of the pitch there. And I'll share this deck. We're almost at time. We've got 5 minutes. I'd like to take some questions, but we can, if you guys want to, kind of run over some of these best practices.
Hey, Mike, real quick, Jamie asked a really good question in the chat that I did answer in the chat, but I know not everybody, I know I don't. I'm not real good at like paying attention to a presentation and paying attention to chat at the same time. So when we get into Q&A, I'd like to just sort of answer it out loud, so for those that aren't reading the chat can benefit from the answer, because it was a really good question.
Sorry, what was the question?
If you're ready for Q&A now, I can.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So Jamie had asked, with the announcement of the new Power Platform developer plan, can 2 or more developers work the same solution in their own dev environments and then use either pipelines for Power Platform? And Jamie, just for clarity, we're not allowed to call it Power Pipelines from a marketing and branding perspective. So its official term is pipelines for Power Platform. It's a legal nuance. So just clarity.
Oops.
So
Sorry.
Or the ALM Accelerator to merge their work. And the answer really is, I wrote it down and I'll read it, right? But Pipelines for Power Platform today isn't designed for that scenario in its current GA release, right? So the short answer is no, you can't do that with Pipelines for Power Platform today in any easy way, right? But it is a scenario that the team wants to enable, and tongue in cheek, for better or worse, in the fullness of time, right? Like it's a well understood problem domain that eventually we want to get to. However, for the foreseeable future, the short term, people will need to light this scenario up themselves by extending Pipelines for Power Platform, sort of in the way that Mike alluded to. However, we already enable this in the ALM Accelerator. Like, I'm not saying it's easy, and I'll get to that part, right? But we already support that scenario mechanically in the ALM Accelerator. And we will continue to focus on this scenario in the ALM Accelerator as it evolves to be an extension and help people use Pipelines for Power Platform in combination with the ALM Accelerator, right? Say that 3 times fast. However, and this is the thing I want to call out and acknowledge, because people would otherwise just immediately chime in and say, yeah, but it's too hard, right? To really do this productively, right? I work in my dev environment, you work in your dev environment. We truly work on small units of work, commit often, PR often, resolve merge conflicts and work harmoniously in the traditional software engineering model. There are improvements that need to happen in the platform in general, including the file formats, right, that solutions are unpacked to. If anybody's ever tried to do small commits, PR often, merge often, CI/CD, that it is the file formats today and how noisy they are that makes that somewhat difficult to do, right? That is a well understood problem as well within the product group. And there is actually I'll find the link for it because the browser's still open. There is a release notes item that is very vague right now, and I will probably be fairly vague in my explanation of the release notes item too, unfortunately. Not because I'm trying to be coy, but reality is sometimes when we make release notes announcements, the details of the actual implementation isn't quite refined yet, right? So we're not ready to share them. But the release notes allude to the fact that there's ongoing work to make solution export more source code repository friendly. Like, I will be candid with you, temper your expectations of the first wave of this, right? It is mostly the kinds of things that create noisy diffs, like XML nodes being in different inconsistent order, export after export, attributes being in the wrong order, which makes the diffs noisy, right? So phase 1 is really about solving some of that. Longer term, as the in-product ALM roadmap, and this is where I have to get very calculated with my words, because what I know and what I'm allowed to say, right? It is an aspiration to get to a world where source control integration with Power Platform ALM just feels seamless and easy button. But we recognize that we're not there yet. Does that make sense? Cool.
Yeah, I don't think I could have answered that any better. So thanks, Mark.
Appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Thank you all.
Yeah, that was awesome, Mike. Thanks for presenting, and Mark, thank you for jumping in and managing the board and adding so much insight.